We are reading from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel."
Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
Thank you to Denny and Jean Kuntz for reading our Christmas story, the portion of the Christmas story we're going to be talking about today. He served as one of our elders the past year as the chairman of our elders, and just done a phenomenal job in leading and guiding and helping protect our church family as we walked through our year. Now, we're kind of a little bit after Christmas, and this is kind of what in pastor's terms is called dead man zone. You know, do you do a Christmas message? Do you do a New Year's message? You're not sure because it's not New Year's, it's not Christmas. But it's a time where you kind of reflect a little bit. And so this morning, I was kind of reflecting on Christmas, and I realized something, and this is going to be profound, that there are two types of people in this world. Those who live for Christmas. You know, they can't wait till the day after probably Valentine's Day when the stores start putting out their Christmas displays. You know, how many of you, that's you? Like, man, I can't wait for Christmas, like Christmas. Now, there's the other type of people who kind of at best tolerate Christmas. And it's like no Christmas music till after Thanksgiving. We kind of got to respect the turkey a little bit. So how many of you are like that? You know, yes, all right. Like last service, it was kind of way the other way. But hey, I'm kind of glad for that. You know, I've realized something. Christmas changes as you get older, doesn't it? You remember when you were a kid, you used to can't wait for Christmas, and the anticipation of Christmas was almost greater than the gifts you received. You know, and then you kind of remember there's a time where maybe you got something where the gift was greater than the anticipation. You know, for me, that was my 11th birthday, where growing up in the Chute household, I got my first hunting gun. You know, I got it for my 11th, and it was like, man, the anticipation did not match up to what that gift represented. You know, for me, it was a time where even now I look back and think of times walking through the woods with grandpa and cousins and brother and dad, and with all those people, it's a wonder we all came out alive. But that's okay. You know, it's just one of those things where the memories were pretty incredible. You know, we've been talking about joy. And when we think about Christmas, oftentimes we're filled with joy. You know, I just reflected on this Christmas for my family, and our son was engaged this Christmas. All of our kids, including their either spouse or significant others or now fiancés, were all in the house with us. My parents came into town. We're going to see my in-laws this week. But there's also part of it that's kind of a sad joy. You know, as I walk into my house, there are things in my house that I remember that aren't there this Christmas. On my table in front of my sofa, coffee table, there's two jars. One is filled with ribbon candy, you know, the most awful tasting candy in the world. You know what I'm talking about? It kind of tastes like medicine. But yet that represents and reminds me that I have a heritage through my grandpa Davis, my mom's dad, who every Christmas we would go to their house and there would be this ribbon candy that tasted like medicine. So when I put it in my mouth, the taste is horrible, but the memories are sweet. You know, in the other jar are peppermints, and whenever my grandma Chute, my dad's mom, would be there, she had a huge old suitcase of a purse, and I don't know what all she carried in it, but what I do know is in the bottom there was always peppermints. And so she would hand us one, and those are just reminders of what was. You know, the goodness and what was. And it's kind of funny because the memory of what was often propels the future of what is. Example of that in this story is we were opening presents Christmas morning, and I knew some of the kids would be going, so we were just kind of going to do a fast Christmas. And we got in, and I said, okay, we're going to open presents, and I was going to hand them out, and my daughter looked and said, we're forgetting something. I'm like, what are we forgetting? She's like, we didn't read the Christmas story. And for 46 years of my life, every Christmas we've read the Christmas story before, and that was a part of what she remembered that she wanted to carry forward. You know, when we think of this Christmas series, Unboxing the joy of Christmas, what I realize is this series can be something that propels us into a new year in an incredible way. And what I hope to do this morning is kind of walk through this series and begin to put together with the story of the wise men exactly how the joy of Christmas can propel us into the future. You know, as we began to look at this series, that first week, we talked about the idea in the box of hope. And when Isaiah, kind of the beginning of the Christmas story in the Old Testament, Isaiah foretold the coming of this Christ child. And he told it at a time when Israel had no hope. They were in captivity. The days were dark. They were dreary. People didn't have a hope for the future. But yet Isaiah said, one who is coming, who will save you, who will be your king. And what we learn from that is that through this Christ child, no matter how dark our days are, no matter how down we seem, there is always the hope that comes with Jesus Christ. The second week, we talked about the trustworthiness. We unboxed the box of trust. When it was time for God to send his son, there was somebody who needed to kind of say he was coming. And so we looked at the part of the Christmas story where Elizabeth and Zechariah were told that they would have John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was the person who kind of told everybody that the Messiah, that Jesus was coming. And so he's kind of known as the forerunner of Christ. But the problem was God promised Zechariah and Elizabeth a son, but they were getting old. And, you know, as they got old, things happen in life and no longer can you have children. And so they were like, okay, we misread this promise. We're not sure God can keep that promise anymore. And so when God said, you are now with child, they laughed at him. They basically said, you know, we can't trust you. And what we learned through that story is that when God gives us a promise, we can trust it. When God tells us something is going to happen, put it in the bank, it's going to get done. You know, it's one of those things that we believe that through Jesus Christ, we can trust like never before. You know, box 3, we talked about the idea of Christ brings us courage. When God was born to Joseph and Mary, what we understand is that it happened in the most unconventional way. You know, it happened in a way that went against societal norms. You know, first of all, he was born of a virgin, but not only was he born of a virgin, he was given a mother and father who weren't even married at the time. At best, what would happen in that society is they would be cast out. The worst that would happen is they would be put to death. And so when the angel came and said these two words, fear not, it gave them an unbelievable courage. And what we learn from that is that no matter what God calls us to do, no matter how unconventional it may seem, he's going to give us the courage we need to face the days that are ahead of us. And then the last box that we looked at was the box of relationship. And that the person of Jesus Christ came in order to bring us back into relationship with him. And on Christmas Eve, Lawrence talked to us about this idea of 3 concepts we can see. Good news, great joy, all people. The relationship that Christ brings, he desires to have to all people. And we have a responsibility to help spread that good news. And that's why I love Psalm chapter 40 that we read earlier, where it said that by our attitudes and by our actions and by those things that we profess about God, others will see, fear, and worship who he is. But the problem with this is up until this point, everything has worked out perfectly in the Christmas story. You know, it's been great. It's almost one of those fairy tale moments. But the problem is, Christ in the Christmas story is going to be revealed to people who don't accept him and people who don't know how to understand him. And thus, that's where the story of the wise men come in. Now, how many of you at home have a manger scene at your house of some kind? How many of you have it? You know, a lot of us have those sitting around our house. Now, how many of you have the wise men at the manger scene? How many of you are sitting right next to the shepherds there? Not as many, but most of us. Well, at our house, it drives me up the wall, but I have to say it, the shepherds are right by the wise men. Now, you may say, why does that bother you? Because in a second, we're going to see the story of what happens. In fact, let's jump there right now. In Matthew chapter 2, it says this. Excuse me. In Matthew chapter 2, it says, now after Jesus was born. Now, what that tells us is it's been a little while since Jesus was born. You know, the wise men should not be at the manger scene by the shepherds. Now, in our house, when the kids were younger, I used to have fun with this because I used to take the wise men and kind of move them across the room to make sure that they weren't there. And so my kids got that bright idea to start moving the manger scene over. You know, Tammy got the willow tree manger scene. And so one day we come home from a date, and all of a sudden there are two sheep that seem to be missing their ears. And we're like, what happened? They're like, we moved them and the ears fell off. You know, it's like we didn't do it, but they just kind of fell off. So the next year for Christmas, my wife gets a package. She opens it, has 4 sheep in it. And it says, these are to replace the 2 sheep we broke, the one you didn't know about, and one to be named later that we'll probably break before we grow up. And so they got it back. But the point is this. Sometimes in our Christmas story, it doesn't go exactly how we planned. And this is the way it was here. You know, it had been a period of time since Jesus was born. It says this, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. Now let's take a second and look at Herod the king. Herod was also known as Herod the Great. Wouldn't it be great to have a nickname like that? You know, Chad the Great, you know, or Chad the Courageous. You know, if I told my kids that, you know, they said at best, Dad, you could do Chad a little above average. You know, it's like, okay, maybe a nickname won't work for me, but Herod was known as Herod the Great. During the prime of his reign, there were some pretty cool things that he was able to accomplish. You know, as king of the region under Rome, he actually helped in rebuilding the temple so that the Jewish people would go back and worship their God in the temple. Not only did he recreate the temple and was able to put that back, he also helped rebuild Samaria, which boosted the economy of the nation. And so he was actually leading a booming economy, a time that was pretty impressive. He did some things that were great. In fact, he was helping lead a time that was known as Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome. It was literally a time where Israel was not worrying about would they go into captivity because they felt accepted. They felt at least like they could practice under the norms of the Roman government. And as they began to do that, he was now coming towards the end of his reign. And towards the end of his reign, he actually became kind of a tyrant. He began to be concerned about his legacy. He began to be concerned about somebody else taking the throne from him. And so in the last years, around the time that Christ was born, he actually became so concerned about somebody else taking his throne that he had all 3 of his sons killed. Now, in that time, the sons were actually going to take over the throne from their dad, but he's like, I don't want to give it up prematurely. I don't want him to even consider it, so I'm going to kill him. Not only did he do that, but he said, you know what, my wife is actually a threat to the throne as well, so I'm going to have somebody take care of her, and he had his wife killed as well. So here he is at this time sitting in the palace, and as we heard in the story, the wise men now come and say, we're looking for the king of the Jews. Man, can you imagine that tension that's taking place now? We have King Herod, or Herod the Great, facing off against this king that was now born that these wise men were seeking. And so we have this guy who's trying desperately to hold on to his throne, and he's in great fear of this person of Jesus. You know, as we continue the story, it says that, behold, the wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now, these wise men, I want to get a little understanding of who they are. We kind of sing the old hymn that's kind of really old, We Three Kings of Orient Are. Anybody ever heard of that song? Well, I hate to burst your bubble again, but these guys aren't kings. They actually work for kings. They're kind of the ambassadors, the guys who go around and tell the king what to do or give him advice on how to run the kingdom. So these guys were rich men who were very knowledgeable in the times of the day. And what they said is they knew enough from the history of the Jewish people that a star was going to appear when this Jesus was born. Now, how in the world they knew that, we're not sure, but it's believed that they actually knew it from a long history of Israel, from a guy called Daniel in the Old Testament. And Daniel actually went into captivity. He was a Jewish guy who went into captivity and actually lived a great life in Babylon and actually rose in power at Babylon. And much of his teaching was incorporated into the lifestyle and teachings of the Babylonian culture. And so they knew something was happening. So when these three guys took off to go to another country and see, they wouldn't have been traveling alone. They would have had a huge entourage that traveled with them to cook for them, to care for them, to make sure everything was going well. And quite possibly, they would have had an entire army or section of an army that was traveling with them into the countryside to ensure and protect their safe passage. So as we understand this, these magi, we get this idea of just three lonely guys that are hunched over walking in with their gifts. No, this was a huge entourage that moved with them. And it said that when that entourage moved, and when King Herod heard about these things, verse 3, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. As we look at this, Jerusalem was at peace at that time. Now, I want you to imagine with me that tomorrow morning you wake up, and the first thing you hear on the news is that some foreign officials were coming into Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, with an army behind them and a whole entourage with them. I don't know about you, but in my mind, I would be like, what's going on? There'd be part of me that's a little fearful what's happening. This isn't every day that they come marching through, and I kind of like the way it is. I like my house. It's kind of peaceful. It's kind of quiet. I can go to the store. I don't have to worry. But yet, all of a sudden, these guys were coming into town, and Jerusalem was starting to worry. One author says this. He says that Matthew in this chapter is actually foreshadowing the future of Jesus, who aroused hostility and resentment. He brought upheaval and suffering. So we understand the lack of enthusiasm that was going on and the anxiety and fear that paralyzed Israel at this point in time. In verse 4, it goes on to tell us that after he had heard this, that Herod assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people. He inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told the scribes and priests and told him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler, whom will shepherd my people. Now, when we read this, we have to understand a little bit about these chief priests and scribes. These are two groups of religious people who often stood at odds with each other. So the fact that Herod would bring them both into the same room was a little weird. But the scribes were actually a conservative group of teachers who were so concerned with the law and holding to the historical truths of the Jewish people. And so what they would do is they would walk around and just make sure every dot and every T was crossed, making sure everyone acted the right way, and making sure no law from the Old Testament was lost. And so these were kind of those religious zealots of the day. Now the chief priests, they were a little different. They went around and they held to the law as well, but they were trying to juggle the Roman government and the law at the same time. They were trying to find out how can we live at peace and kind of live with the Roman government, give them what they need while still maintaining our Jewish heritage. And so in essence, the scribes and the chief priests didn't like each other at all. The scribes looked at the chief priests and said, you guys are sellouts. The chief priests looked at the scribes and said, you guys are old fuddy-duddies who don't get with the times. Come on. Actually, it kind of sounds a little like some churches today. But anyway, this was the religious part of the day. And Herod says, I want to inquire from you about this Jesus. And it's interesting because they all gave the same answer. They went back to the Old Testament and told about this person coming. He's going to come from Bethlehem. There's going to be a star. They're coming. And they said this. And I can tell you this. Whenever you get two differing religious views in the same room and they agree on something, it's probably true. And you know, when these guys came together and Herod brought them together and they said the same thing, I can just picture Herod saying, oh man, we've got to take care of this. You know, it's interesting because there now are four groups of people: Herod, the city of Jerusalem, the chief priests and scribes, and the Magi, who all are at a dilemma. What are we all going to do with this person of Jesus Christ? How are we going to respond to what we know about Jesus? You know, the thing that I realize is that each one of us are in that same point in our lives often. We discover something new. We understand something different. Things are happening in our life that we don't understand, and we have a choice. Are we going to respond with hope, with trust, with courage, with the relationship that we have? Or are we going to choose to respond in a different way? And what we choose to respond and how we choose to respond will propel us in different directions. You know, as we look at this passage, I believe it's imperative that we begin to ask the question, how are we going to respond in this next year when we discover more about who this Jesus is? You know, in this passage, the first person we looked at was Herod. And I believe that when Herod discovered who Jesus was, it led him to become angry. You know, it was enough that Herod decided that he was going to kill his kids and his wife. But it's interesting because in verse 16, it tells us how he responded in fear. It says, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained. Now, can you imagine this? They're just finding out, Jerusalem's really beginning to hear this story of Jesus about a year later, and all of a sudden, all of the children 2 years under, the male children, are being killed. You know, what he decided to do, he said, you know what, I may not be able to control something right now, but I'm going to do whatever I can to control the situation no matter what. You know, what I realize is when I become angry, I begin to write my own narrative, right or wrong, and begin to try to control the situation. Anger causes us not to see clearly the one who has come to redeem us. Anger can cause us to take matters into our own hands rather than relying on the one who came to redeem us. You know, in this story, what we know is Herod didn't live much longer as king. He was actually overthrown because of the upheaval that took place. And what we can learn from Herod is that when we come face to face with Jesus Christ, our response cannot be anger. But I find too often for myself, that sometimes happens. You know, I may not be bold enough to come out and say, man, God, I'm mad at you. But the internal tension that takes place when things don't go as I've scripted, when I feel like I'm losing control, when the situations around me don't make sense, internally I begin to question. Internally I begin to lose the hope and the joy that He intended for me to have. The second group of people that we see is the city of Jerusalem. It said that Jerusalem became fearful and concerned. You know, fear causes us to run from, turn away from, or turn against that which we're afraid. You know, oftentimes in our lives when God puts things that are there, whether it's hardship or hurt or joy, we can tend to lean out. When we don't understand and we become fearful, we begin to turn away and begin to say, you know what, I'm not sure I even want to face what is happening. But rather, what God desires from us when things aren't as they seem, He desires us to lean in, desires us to lean on the hope and the trust and the courage and the relationship that brings us the joy that we need in life. You know, in it being fearful, rather than leaning away, can I challenge us, lean into what God has for each one of us? The third response that we see is from the scribes and the chief priests. And their discovery of Jesus deepened the apathy that they had towards him. You know, when we begin to look at this, it is not uncommon for the religious privileged, those that know Christ the best in knowledge, to give him the least amount of honor. You know, when I don't understand it, but there's something that happens when we gain an intellectual understanding of Christ that oftentimes, if we're not careful, does not allow the transforming work of the Holy Spirit to work within our lives. That's what happened with these guys. They could quote the entire Old Testament and knew the prophecy of the Christ child coming to Bethlehem, but yet when they were confronted with the truth of who he was, there was an apathetic spirit that says, I know it and I'm going to leave it. You know, too often in my life, I've seen that happen, especially with those who have spent a long time at church or have a long heritage of faith in their family. You know, last night we were at a birthday party for my boys. I asked my wife why at 23 we had to throw a birthday party for my boys. But she's like, we just have to. And so I'm like, okay, we have to. So we did. And we had people over to our house, and somehow she got excited. Excuse me. Somehow she got excited about the idea of Bible trivia. And somehow we started doing some Bible trivia, and I'm like, I hate this game. It shows me how much I don't know. But as we began to do that, my kids started ripping off the answers to this thing. And they were giving answers that I didn't even know. And what I found in my spirit as I began to think about this, because I have to be honest, I wasn't thinking about the party. I was preaching the message over in my head. But as I began to think about this idea of apathy, my prayer for them last night was this: God, don't allow the knowledge that they have in their head to supersede the transformation you desire in their hearts. Because ultimately what we're talking about is a heart change that takes place that causes us to respond to God in the right way. So we look at that. The first three responses we've seen, fear, anger, apathy, are all responses that draw us away from the person of Jesus Christ, who we desire to see. But the third group of people, the Magi, responded in a different way. In verse 10 it says this: when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. The scribes and the Pharisees, King Herod, they all had more information and better information about the Christ child than the Magi did. But the difference between them and the Magi is that the Magi responded to what they saw in front of them. They saw the child, the Christ child. They realized he was God. And I'm sure they had a million other questions because they didn't come from the religious few. But yet it says they bowed down and worshiped him. Can I tell you that the only acceptable response when we discover God in a new way, or we have something in our life that doesn't make sense, or even things that are great, the only proper response is to fall on our knees and worship? You know, as we begin to do that, what I want us to understand is worship is not alone what we do on a Sunday morning. You know, we were in a staff gathering with a few of the staff, and Chris was bringing us a devotional, and he asked us a question that pierced the heart of this subject. You know, there's some questions sometimes that you ask, and they just kind of get right to the heart of the matter. And I'm sure I don't have this quote exact, but Chris ultimately asked this question: are we more in love with the motions and the emotions of our worship than we are the one who we worship? You know, stop and think about that for a second. Are we more in love with the motion and emotion of our worship than the one that we are worshiping? You know, as I began to think about that question, a bunch of questions began to flood my mind. I began to ask, Chad, when was the last time a new song was on your heart? When was the last time you really saw God do something new in your life and you told others about him? Or is it like the scribes who would say, way back when we were told? I remember 10 years ago when God, and while those things can propel us into the future, if we are not constantly discovering God and what he is doing in our lives and open to what he is doing, can I tell you we're no better off than the scribes and Pharisees who will miss the blessing that is right in front of us? As we begin to do that, one of the questions that I always have to ask myself is, Chad, how in the world, in the midst of a difficult time, can we honor and praise the God who we discover? And the best example I have of that is probably my Aunt Linda. My Aunt Linda, when my wife and I were first married, she was diagnosed with ALS. And when she was diagnosed with ALS, she was very active. She was a person who loved to be out in the yard playing with us nieces and nephews and her 3 kids that were all in junior high and high school at the time. But very quickly, she wasn't able to do that, and she lost everything. She literally lost her husband. She lost the financial stability that they had, and she ended up moving to a place that was new to her. And for her in her life and her stage, what she was saying is, I want to praise God through everything, but I know myself well enough. I can't get too far ahead of myself. So, doctors, I just want you to let me know what my next step is. I want to know what my next step is. I want to handle it with grace. I want to handle it with dignity. And I want to handle it in a way that shows those who come behind me how to honor God. But one day she was watching TV, and on TV they were doing a fundraiser for ALS, and she heard a statement that haunted her for several days. And that's this, that ALS is 100% fatal. It's inevitable. And as she began to think about that, she began to spiral. It's one of those things where you begin to think about that, man, this is going to take my life, and it just spiraled. But then one day she was reading in God's Word. And it said that he knows the number of hairs that are on your head. And he knows the number of breaths that you will take in your life, and he orders those. And she finally realized something. She realized, this disease is not going to take my life. God has each one of my days numbered for me, and I am going to live for him each one of those days. What did she realize? She realized that with Christ, there was hope for the future because he had promised faithful in the past. I can trust his promises that he has numbered my days, and there will not be one day short because he has numbered my days. And I am going to rejoice in the fact that he knows my days. I am not going to face this disease with fright and fear, but with courage, because he tells me to fear not, even in the unconventional circumstances. And I can choose joy because of the relationship that I now have in him. You know what? All of a sudden, for me, I could understand how, with what she knew, like the Magi, could fall on her knees and worship God even in the most difficult circumstances. As we think about this next year, I have no idea what it holds. I don't know the good, the bad. I don't know the joys or the trials. But what I do know is this, that if I choose to follow the Christmas story, I can have nothing but joy as I face the future. As we approach this new year, my challenge to us is that we would commit to worshiping God with our actions, our words, and our life. In Romans chapter 12:1, it gives us a great picture of this. It says, I appeal to you, brothers. Paul is speaking. He says, I appeal to you, brothers, by God's mercy, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable act of worship. If this is the only place that we come to worship, if this is the only time we are ascribing worth to God, I think we've missed the mark. I believe that the actions and attitudes that we have every single day show more of our ability to worship than what we do corporately. You know, if we begin to look at this Christmas story and really begin to unpack the joy that is in the story, the hope, the trust, the courage, the relationship, I believe that throughout the next year, others will begin seeing and will begin worshiping God because of how we handle our lives. And it's my prayer that this Christmas story, this idea of uncovering and unboxing the joy that is found in this season, will do an incredible work both in our lives and in our communities, because no matter what we face, the joy of Christ will come through. Father, we thank you so much for the Christmas story. Lord, we thank you for the joy that can come because we understand the hope, the trust, the courage, and the relationship that are only found in you. Lord, I pray that as we leave here today, that others would see that in our lives and others would begin honoring and praising you for who you are. And we ask it all in your Son's name. Amen.